when we have had significant complex PTSD, what we wind up seeing is that this fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, whichever one is the go-to one for your nervous system, it can really activate around grief. So one of the ways that I work with people around grief is to get them acquainted with what is happening within your nervous system, what is going on, how is this related to your developmental trauma. It's interweaving the trauma-informed care with helping someone learn to deal with their grief and learn to manage it.
I'm Dr. Charlie Hornis, ex-highly anxious people pleaser turned master certified professional life coach. Learning to manage my brain was so life-changing for me that I got certified so that I could teach these incredible evidence-based practices to you. Are you ready for massive change? Let's go.
So excited. We've got Honey Henderson-Owens, and she is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's here to talk to us about mental health and how it relates to the brain. So, Honey, would you tell us who you are and what you do?
Absolutely, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me on today. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have my master's in social work, and I work here in the state of Texas. And I'm in private practice, and I also do work with people via telehealth across the state, primarily with trauma and grief. And I do work with people who have done a lot of developmental trauma work that happens when we are children or in long-term relationships. A lot of times we will get what's called complex PTSD. We work both with processing their issues and with just what goes on with them day to day. And I see individuals, families, couples from 13 up to 113. And a lot of my clients happen to be women, but I also serve men. And I also have a niche in the LGBTQIA plus community. I do work with that. And that's actually a pretty specialized area because not everybody is qualified to work with that population. And I am trauma informed. And I'm really passionate about this just because I love what I do.
Okay, back up. You said trauma informed. You're probably going to have to explain what is trauma informed blank. It's trauma informed care. It's trauma informed. There's all kinds of titles. What is that?
So trauma informed, what that means is that we are aware of how trauma affects the body and the mind and how the two intersect with one another. And I have specific training that allows me to talk with people who have been traumatized, either single issue, which might be, I've lived my life, it's been great, but I had a car accident and I'm dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've been diagnosed with that. So I deal with that, but I also deal with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and it deals with developmental trauma. And so what we do when we are being trauma-informed is we do not necessarily go back and require the person to relive what it was that they went through. We meet them in the here and now, talk about how that trauma is affecting them currently, whether it's emotionally, physically, spiritually, whatever, mentally, whatever is happening. And we help them to learn how to manage their symptoms in the current time. And it also deals with relationships and our relationship to them. But mostly it's about providing them with a safe space for them to process and deal with the effects that trauma has had on their life.
So, Honey, tell us, are there specific strategies that are different than your sort of typical licensed clinical mental health providers are using to provide therapy? I know there's all kinds of different strategies, but when you're talking about particularly trauma-informed care, how is that different?
One of the things I think that we think of that is different is we slow down the process of how we deal with our clients. So, for instance, one of the areas that is a shared symptom between those two is overwhelm. And that can be an overwhelming sense of emotional activation. It can be an overwhelming sense of like a flashback. It can be an overwhelming physical sensation. So what we do is when we are working with our clients, we really slow down the process. And so what it does is it gives the person space to be able to get their adult self, their rational self online. Because what's happening when you're having an overwhelm or you're in the middle of a trauma, your body is doing what it is supposed to do. It is keeping you alive. And we honor that in the biggest, most amazing way. But what that means is that takes your prefrontal cortex, which is this part of your brain, that takes that offline. So that's the rational part of your brain. That's the brain that helps you to, make decisions about day-to-day life and stuff like that. And it throws it to, I like to refer to it as the monkey brain, your amygdala in the back of your brain. And it's a much more primitive part of your brain. Whatever happens within milliseconds, it never runs through your conscious mind. So therefore, when something happens, when you are traumatized, this part of your brain is not online and it is not able to actually function properly. So when we slow things down, we actually allow space for this part of your brain to come back online.
A lot of us struggled with or are continuing to struggle today with the whole fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Somebody comes at you with some aggression, they're hostile, they're criticizing. A lot of people, however, dread the holidays. Even Halloween's a little stressful for parents, especially. All these things happening out there, especially now, this stressful season that is now upon us financially, going home to relationships that are probably, most of us do have, some dysfunction in our families. And so my point is that I know a lot of my listeners struggle with the interpersonal, what you were just saying about how our prefrontal cortex goes offline and our monkey brain comes online in nanoseconds. I read in my research that the prefrontal cortex always defers to the survival mechanism.
And there is a really good biological reason for that because it takes so much energy in the front of your brain and it takes so much time to process information and filter it through the prefrontal cortex that by the time you got to the point of I'm about to hit a car and I need to put my foot on the brake in order not to hit the car, you've already hit the car and crashed. So the prefrontal cortex naturally, biologically, understands that there is a millisecond, a moment, the difference between life and death or life and severe injury. So, for instance, one of the most interesting things that I learned in graduate school is that the brain does not read emotional pain and physical pain any differently. So they have actually done studies where they have taken Advil, Tylenol, and pain relief or anti-inflammatory drugs and given them to people who are experiencing mental distress or emotional distress. And it has actually relieved their emotional distress. So that is a really fascinating thing to understand, is that specifically talking about the situation with the holidays coming up, one of the things that I want your listeners to understand is that when we have these experiences of feeling overwhelmed or feeling emotionally activated by somebody that we're in close proximity to, especially somebody we've had a relationship with, whether it's a parent or a former former partner or something like that, that is not actually something that you can control. That is something that is happening below the level of your ability to think about it. So while there are a ton of ways that we can try to circumvent that, one of the things that we know is really helpful is to learn about what some of the relational strategies that you've had in the past or relationships that are problematic for you, and to process some of your stuff, some of your issues related to that, so that your body no longer feels unsafe. Because essentially what is happening is your body is reading that person as emotionally unsafe, that they are a threat to your life. That is how your body is reading that. And that's why we go into the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn mode. It is because your body believes that you will die if you interact with this person. And yes, I know that that's a big whole statement, but that's actually what your body's job is to keep you alive. So when we understand that initially, it's a fantastic space for jumping off into, okay, who are these people? What are they doing? How am I interacting with them? How do I feel when I'm with them? And that's the work that I do, is we're working through, like, are you feeling shame when you're around this person? Are you feeling blame when you're around this person? Are you feeling like a little kid? Are you feeling like you don't have control? Because your body is going to kick into that space if you don't prepare yourself ahead of time to deal with the situation.
So in thought work coaching, when we're having the feeling around the relationship, when I'm coaching, my first question is, well, what are you thinking? What is the thought that you're having? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but from our school of coaching practice, which is thought work and mind management, our thoughts create our feelings. Because your brain is creating these thoughts and scenarios that influence your feelings. I work with more high-functioning folks that are looking at specific issues and they want to go forward. I am not trying to provide counseling and therapy at all. However, so that being said, I would ask, well, what are you thinking to create? That's creating the feeling, the connecting what you just said about the physiology, the feelings that are created in our bodies and our brains not seeing the difference. Would you also say that you could trace it back to the thought? Break that apart for us.
Okay. So what you're saying from a more highly functional person who has more access to their prefrontal cortex and has more access to resources and what we call like scaffolding of resources, where you understand how this thing works and that thing works, and you really integrated that into who you are as a human being. Yes, I would say that in a lot of cases is what's going on. However, when I'm dealing with somebody who is dealing with severe complex PTSD, it is the situation does not actually develop necessarily in their thought process, because, and I'll tell you why, it's kind of fascinating. A lot of complex PTSD, the trauma happened prior to someone being verbal. So the part of their brain that would be able to tell us this story, would be able to give us this information, didn't exist. It had not developed yet. And so that is why when we go into these more depth-oriented models, we're utilizing the top-down, which is what you're describing and is a fantastic way to go about things, where we're talking about our thoughts and how they influence the body. But we also want to be dealing with bottom-up and how our body holds a lot of the trauma that we have, especially early developmental trauma. There's a fantastic book that I gave the link to by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And there are several other fantastic books for people who want to delve more into sort of that more complex PTSD developmental trauma world, who may not have as much access to that prefrontal cortex work. Sometimes people simply can't access that. And so when they're sitting with me, what I would be talking about and determine what's going on is to ask them, hey, in your system, and I'm meaning your brain and your body, where are you feeling this? Is something coming up? Do you have like a sense of a feeling, a physical sensation in your body? And a lot of times where we know that sympathetic nervous system comes into effect, they will feel something here in the center part of their body, kind of from their throat down to their stomach. It might be butterflies in the stomach. It might be a pressure on the chest. It even might be a sense of not feeling like they can speak. And all of that, it's not always this way, but a lot of times it's probably related to pre-verbal complex trauma, and it's developmental in nature. So that's a really kind of easy way to figure out if somebody has some stuff going on that might be older than they're remembering with their concrete memories, if you will.
The prefrontal cortex isn't developed in children until like 25 or something like that. But yeah. Are you talking about infancy?
Yes. So
can you say more about that? I'm not sure we understand what you mean by that.
Okay. So between the ages of 0 and 2, developmentally, our brains are, and then again, there's a continuation. There's a huge I shouldn't even say rewiring. It's a huge wiring of the brain between the ages of 0 and 2. And a lot of times what is going on at that point is we are identifying safe sources of harbor, meaning like safe caregivers, safe in our environment. We are developing like our sight, because infants are very, very nearsighted. And so like that works to help with mothers to bond with their infants, because the infant is really close and can see the mother. So all of that is happening between the ages of 0 and 2. So here is something that is incredibly fascinating, that is sort of one of the things that we refer to as a harm reduction situation. So when a child is adopted, as for instance, a newborn, and they are nonverbal because they have not developed in their brain or developed in their vocal cords or anything. They have not developed the ability to speak yet. So we do know that there is trauma that occurs when someone is adopted, even when they are adopted within the first few days of their life. And it is because there is a connection between the birth mother and child that is then severed when they are adopted. I say that this is a harm reduction situation because the person that is the birth mother may not have the ability to take care of the child. And so many adoptive parents are amazing and have raised amazing people. That doesn't mean, though, that there isn't some sort of trauma that comes from that. And what we're saying is that things like this that have a positive eventual outcome sometimes do create a trauma just because of the way that the human system works. And so that is just a broad example of, for instance, a pre-verbal trauma where someone may hold something in their bodies and not realize that it is related to this very, very early experience. And so we use the term environmental failure as opposed to like blaming a person or blaming a system or blaming a whatever. We say that it's an environmental failure because something in the system was not attuned to the child and their needs at that moment and at that given time. And it doesn't mean that it was done intentionally. And it doesn't mean that anybody's out to traumatize the kid. It doesn't mean that anybody's out to hurt the kid. But something happened that for that singular individual, something didn't work the way that it was supposed to. And so that's what we're going back and processing and helping with.
How would somebody know to seek out that type harm reduction and trauma informed care with a professional like yourself? Because they can't figure out what's going on.
Well, I think number one, if you find yourself as a human being, like you said, you were in a stressful situation. And let's be honest, humans venture into stressful situations all day long, every day, in different aspects of their life. If you find that these stressful situations, similar things keep happening no matter where you go. Like if you find a pattern, is to ask them about their work environment and to tell me about their work life. And how do you feel about this? And what happens? And a lot of times, someone who has developmental trauma is going to have patterns that show up in the workplace. And here's why that is. So just about everybody has heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a DSM-5 diagnosis and has been a diagnosis for decades at this point. The main areas that we think of in that are you've got intrusive thought, like intrusions that could be your flashbacks, things like that. You've got a sense of overwhelm where your emotions basically take over. One of the other areas is avoidance. So you're avoiding the thing that you did before the event happened, the trauma happened. So I use a car, for example, if you're in a car accident, like you avoid driving a car, you avoid going to the place where you were. So those are some examples of the ways that PTSD shows up. Here are the additional things that happen with complex PTSD. There are 3 additional areas that make complex PTSD particularly insidious and particularly hard to deal with. One is that you have trouble making and maintaining relationships, like building, growing, starting, and maintaining relationships. That can be in your intimate life. That can be friendship. That can be with your family of origin. That could be in the workplace. That's why I say the workplace is a place that I go to and ask about relationships, because you'll see patterns that show up. The second one is that most people, especially with PTSD, have emotion regulation issues. So, for instance, their brains usually, because it's developmental and it's when their brain is forming, their amygdala may actually be larger. And as you said earlier, the prefrontal cortex says, hey, amygdala, you're the one in charge. So if you have a larger, more highly functional amygdala, you're going to have a hard time with regulating your emotions, because anything that comes at you, you're going to have an immediate response to it that you do not physically have a way to stop. So the third thing that is particularly insidious with CPTSD is the idea of not understanding self. Because complex PTSD, what it does is, again, developmental trauma. When you are with a caregiver or in an environment that as a child, as an infant, as a toddler, you don't feel safe, you have to make a decision to either honor what you feel, want, and need from the situation, or you have to lower yourself below the situation and fight it, flee from it, freeze, or people please on it in order to make it work. Because your life literally depends on it. So the reason that comes up in the CPTSD is you have no earthly idea who is in here because it has never been safe for you to feel that. So those are the three additional things over PTSD that come up with CPTSD that make it particularly hard to deal with.
Wow, that is powerful. What would be some of the tells at work, for example? You said there would be, obviously, we can say, unregulated emotion, but what if somebody's questioning right now in this moment, wow, is that me? Like, what would you say to them that would be a pattern they could look for? I mean, does that exist?
It does. A lot of times what will happen with people is that they start out and they're really excited about their job. Here's one that I've seen a lot. I'm not saying this happens with all people with CPTSD, but it's one that I've seen quite a bit. So they start out, they're super excited about their job, and then they begin sort of, I'm not going to say picking fights because they're not doing it intentionally, but they begin having discord with their coworkers. And they're having a tough time getting along with their managers. And they're having a tough time figuring things out at work and how the politics work and all of that stuff. And this is somebody who may have been in the workplace for a while and should probably kind of be able to navigate that, but they still can't. So that's one tell. Another one is overworking. Like workaholic, that is a lack of boundary. That is a lack of being able to put up a space and say, you know what? I can't actually work until 10 o'clock at night because, again, your job is your entire identity. You don't have an identity necessarily out of the job. So that might be another way that it shows up. And that workaholism situation is kind of that fawn response. It's that like people pleasing. I'm going to do whatever the job tells me to do. Another one would be something that would happen would be constantly stepping on other people to get up the ladder, but in the process, destroying all of the relationships in their path. So that's another like sympathetic nervous system. So you'd think of that as like sort of a fight response, like you're trampling on people all your way up. And another one would be to just moving jobs really quickly without actually waiting to see what's going to come out. So that would show up more as like the fleeing response, the flight response. So those are some ways that it might show up in work. Yeah.
Wow. I think that's going to help a lot of people if they can start to identify some of that. And I know some folks, their immediate response is going to be, well, okay, I resonate with that. It was another person. There was a bad manager. There was conflict. When people are hearing this and they're relating, often the brain is going to resist it. How would you handle that?
Well, what I would say is that these strategies that you are encountering are your big, amazing, beautiful brain's way of surviving. And a lot of times they've been with you since you were a little person and they have served you well. And it isn't our job to get rid of your achieving part of yourself. It isn't our job to get rid of any of this. These strategies exist for a reason. The thing is that in my view, and in the way that the modalities that I most often turn to, one of those strategies or multiples of those strategies are overwhelming the system as opposed to functioning within their lane. They've taken over the whole system. So for instance, if we're thinking about like a relational situation where our friend, the overachiever who's stepping on everybody on the way up the ladder, what I would say is good for you for being an amazingly like energetic and super passionate about your job. And like, those suckers just, they weren't fast enough or good enough or like whatever. What I would say is like, I got you, I get you, I understand you, but also, you know what? Those people may be part of your network at some point, and you might need to rely on them for information on a deal. You might need them for support if you get fired from a job. They might know about a job opening. And if you have like cut them off, acted like a jerk, been terrible to them, then you have cut off those relationships for the rest of your life. So like, think of it as instead of I'm climbing up the ladder and kicking it out from the people beneath me, how about we're all climbing up the ladder and some of us are going to go higher than others, but we want to maintain these relationships because these people are still human and they still need to be validated and acknowledged. And they may have amazing ideas that nobody's paid attention to that you can help enact that help both of you. We're not looking to change who you are. We're looking to keep you from efforting, which is one of my favorite words. We're keeping you from efforting so much.
You said efforting, like putting effort into something. You're efforting too much.
Yeah.
You coined a verb. I love it. Or is that used in the trauma-informed care?
That is used in the neuroaffective relational model. So I cannot take credit for that, but I sure love that term a whole lot. So
you introduced all of us to a new term that we need to consider. Are we efforting too much in our lives? I've got a place now where I can put everybody's resources in one storefront. What's really cool is when you use the what we call affiliate links, and I'm now becoming an affiliate for a whole bunch of different things. It's all on my website at charliehornesscoaching.com, and it's on the bonus resources page. What happens is when you purchase something off of that, a portion of it goes back to the show. And so what you're doing basically when you buy from there is you're supporting the show at no additional cost to you, which is kind of like the coolest thing ever. It's going to help us continue to create content for you and bring on incredible guests that are, they blow my mind. So I'm hoping they will blow your mind too, whether it's metaphysics and psychology and theology or high fantasy romance. You're going to find your next favorite read right there. Let's go. I want to talk about the shame and the guilt that comes along with these types of things if you have, multiple seemingly failures, right? Or you jump job to job, or you've had the same, like you said, you can identify patterns. Somebody related to that might feel like big shame and guilt physiologically in their bodies. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what part of that is not their fault necessarily?
Well, so this is where in the modalities that I most often get excited about, there is an idea of a child consciousness living within us, and then there is an adult consciousness. And the child consciousness, a lot of times, is these old strategies. And the child consciousness, what is so incredibly important about it is that when you listen to the voices in your head, much like, Charlie, what you're doing with these conversations and helping people to rethink what's going on in their head, if you hear in that voice something that is telling you that an external thing is happening to you, but you're to blame. So here's a perfect example. You might have 11 people that are in a bus accident, okay? Terribly storming outside. We're just hearing about like Hurricane Helen. let's say like Hurricane Helen's at a letter crossing, everyone survives. All 11 people are going to have a different experience of that based on their internal system and based on what their mind is telling them. So somebody who is clearly in child consciousness is going to say something like this. If I had not been standing up, this bus wouldn't have crashed. And so then I would say something to them that says, okay, you're telling me that if you hadn't been standing up, this bus wouldn't have crashed. And they say yes. And I say, okay, well, did the bus crash because you were standing up? Well, no, we were at a low water crossing and da. So that turning the blame and the shame on yourself is very child consciousness. Like if you did in fact stand up and like run into the driver and cause them to, get off the thing, then you would say something like, yeah, I ran into the driver and I knocked him and the thing went off the thing. But you're like, yeah, I did that. That's adult consciousness. Like you did the thing. However, child consciousness takes external things that happen to us and it blames us for them. Whereas adult consciousness takes responsibility for the thing. If you're talking to somebody who's having a different experience than our friend who thinks that the bus that got, hit by the hurricane, the reason for the bus crash, somebody else might have a different experience and say, you know what? I was in a bus crash. I was really scared. My entire sympathetic nervous system is really activated right now. I'm feeling really fearful of getting on a bus anytime soon. Then what you would say to them is, tell me what you need. Tell me what yourself needs in order to feel cared for. What does cared for look like for you? And that person might say, I need to get some extra sleep. I want to go and get some therapy around this. I want to take some slow walks around until I'm able to feel better. I might want to just test out getting on a bus that seems like it's safe. What we term agency in the conversation with somebody who's more in adult consciousness, as opposed to just the whole big bad world is coming in and it's all my fault that all of these things are happening.
Do you have quick tips on how someone might start to interrupt that self-blame, self-doubt, shame, spiral? Is there anything you can do to catch that before you get spun out?
Yeah. And I think one of the things is, some of the work that you're doing, Charlie, with just talking about what is this voice saying to you? Are they blaming you for what's happening? Is this internal voice blaming you for what's happening? Or is this voice asking you what you need to feel better? Or is it automatically turning on you and sort of making you the enemy? That's one quick way to really start that conversation within yourself. What is the voice saying? Where is the blame or the shame directed?
Absolutely. The first step is understanding your circumstance. And so we make a distinction between what is the factual situation happening around you, and then what is the thought you're having about the situation.
You're obviously working with people that are really high functioning and stuff. And some of my people can't even get to the point where they know what is being said in their head. So it's like we may have to start really low on the totem pole and say okay, so where are you feeling this in your body when I'm talking to you about this? Okay, what does that feeling in your body feel like, kind of thing. So it's it really does depend on, where you are on the resource scaffolding, because sometimes there is a conversation in the person's head they start shaming and blaming themselves about like, well, why am I having this thought in the first place? If I can't, have it, if I can't prove it, like I'm a dummy, you can get into this like circle, this logic circle that makes exactly zero sense. But it's like, that's how they have developed the way that they function in the world, is that they have had to take behaviors and strategies to just survive the situations that they've been in. And it's like your empathy and love and power for them and, hope for them a lot of times is what somebody needs to just begin the journey. Because a lot of times people are just borrowing hope from us until they can have it themselves.
I think you identify an answer to a question a lot of people ask me, which is, what's the difference between a life coach and a therapist? How would you define the difference between the work that, I'm doing and then when I need to hand off to someone like you who can do this trauma-informed care and this harm reduction work? Because we don't ever want to cause harm to anyone. And it would be great to hear from, a mental health professional, the difference between what I'm doing and what you're doing and our lanes and when someone might need to decide what they need.
Well, I think that one of the things that I do that I talked about at the beginning of the session is I do really depth-oriented work. So, like, for instance, if somebody knows, even on sort of a subconscious level, or they know consciously, I have had a ton of trauma. A lot of it's related to my childhood, or they have a severe situation where their life is being heavily impacted by something that is happening within their lives. So they are having substance use disorder. They are having a hard time keeping a job, making and keeping relationships going. All of these things are going to be things that I'm going to need to deal with. And here's the thing, Charlie, that's really fascinating is that I'm not even equipped to deal with higher level of care that people need. I have to refer, and have done it recently, I have to refer clients to substance abuse treatment centers that are inpatient or partial hospitalization treatments, or outpatient groups that they work with, because they need really solid core daily or 24-hour care. So even I have to step in and say, hey, look, this is now out of my ability to safely care for you and move on, because I have the same thing that I do with my people that are higher level care, because I'm a flat outpatient person. So I'll see people 1 to 2 times a week, depending on how severe the situation is. But beyond that, I am not equipped to give them the care that they need.
One of the reasons that I asked you that is because life coaching, quote unquote, right, is an entirely unregulated field. Mm-hmm. Anyone can wake up and call themselves a life coach. Mm-hmm. And it's actually dangerous, mm-hmm. because I think that there are folks out there in an entirely unregulated field that are trying to just make a quick buck, providing some kind of counseling session that they don't have any mental health qualifications for. I mean, I even have clinical training, and I don't mess with the lane. And I know when I'm in my lane and when I need to refer. And as much as I, love life coaching, I am the first person to say, y'all, this is an unregulated field. You have got to be careful. You have mm-hmm. got to vet. Mm-hmm. And because if we're talking about, harm reduction work, I'm not sure you're always going to find that when you're in an unregulated field where nobody needs any kind of training versus the training that licensed clinical social workers have to get. It is intense what y'all do.
Yeah. And yes. And I mean, I know because I know you personally that you have a clinical background. I trust your judgment on things like that more than I do some of these sort of pop psychologists, if you will. I mean, to use an old term. And I have several friends that are coaches in some way, whether it's like an executive professional coach or more of like a life coach. But all of them have received extensive training.
My whole catchphrase is, stop feeling terrible. You can stop feeling terrible if you learn all of this neuroscience and our physiology and why we feel what we feel. And yes, there's probably stuff that we just don't know about from infancy. I mean, all the stuff you're teaching us. This is a great segue. I would love for you to transition to what can you tell us about neuroplasticity and the opportunity everyone has for healing?
Well, what I would say is the human brain I refer to it as the big, beautiful brain. I mean, it doesn't matter what your intellectual capacity is. There is a movement in our brains as we heal. And really, neglect and abuse can eventually be overcome with the right treatment and with the right intervention. And what we do is we lean into that space with this person that is hurting, that is having a hard time. We open our heart and we let them borrow some hope until they can find their own. But the other part of it is I have a whole lot of training, thousands and thousands of hours at this point in multiple degrees and all the fun stuff. But ultimately, it is up to the person sitting in front of me, just like it is, Charlie, the person sitting in front of you. It is up to them to determine, like, okay, I want to move forward and I want to feel better. So the first thing that has to happen is they have to buy into the process. And honestly, somebody listening to your podcast, somebody, contacting you through your website, somebody coming to see me, somebody calling me and having a 15-minute free consultation with me is a huge step. That's enormous. And that shows that they're beginning to have buy-in. And if we can just walk along with them and allow them to show us what they need, then there's so much more that can happen out of that, because these little nuggets grow into bigger nuggets that grow into bigger nuggets. And then that we can look back and we can be like, hey, look at all this hard work you did. You did that. Because I'm not doing it. Charlie, you're not doing it. They're doing the work. And it's about us putting the spotlight on them and saying, look at you and your big, beautiful brain and all the work you've done. You amazing human.
Absolutely. With all of our weird and strange parts to all of us, and our brains heal too, right?
I mean, when you begin to make these behavioral adjustments, this movement toward a different way of being, a different way of thinking, a different way of existing in the world, your brain follows you. It allows you to do that. And I mean, we've seen that in miraculous situations.
So I hear some fantastic hope that even folks that are struggling with really significant issues that may be really resonating with a lot of your descriptions of the folks that you work with, that with the proper help and the right, work put into it and trust and maybe, identifying resistance if they can and keep on going, there is a significant level of healing most everybody can obtain in some level, right?
Yes. There are two people I know very well who have children who had stroke in utero, and part of their brain did not develop. And here's the thing, that even with that, these children are able to have relationships love and care. And it may be not at the level of, say, their siblings or whatever, but they are still experiencing life. They are still learning things and growing things. And it's like their brain found a way around the spaces that was literal spaces in their head to allow them to be functional out in society. And so with something like that, that is truly a physical thing that happened to them and their part of their brain did not form, their brain finds a way around it. Like that is amazing and miraculous to me. Because it's like, if something like that is truly like there's a void in the cranial cavity. And I know people who have had severe traumatic brain injury who they figure out that their brains begin to rewire themselves. I mean, how miraculous and cool and amazing. And not to say that it's always going to happen exactly like that, but there are so many instances where it has. And that's the beautiful thing, is that capacity for healing and being the person that we're supposed to be, whatever that looks like for us.
I love that you love the brain as much as I do. I'm totally nerding out right now listening to everything you're saying. I think that this information is, whether we're dealing with high functioning or folks that don't necessarily even know what's happening and need way more in-depth support. Mm-hmm. There's so much that involves our brain and our bodies that mm-hmm. we don't know. Between your work and my work, if we can let folks know so much of the feeling awful mm-hmm. is not about you.
Yeah.
Or a defective piece of you that you can't get right, that everyone else seems to get right. There's just so much about our bodies and our brains that play into so much of our feelings, right?
Yes. And it's that idea of finding a way to create safety for yourself so that your body understands that you are safe. And that's really at the heart of things. That is through working through your thoughts to help you feel safe, or with nonverbal stuff, working through what's happening within your body to be radically concerned about your safety so that you can begin to heal those parts of and those systems within you.
One of your biggest focuses is trauma and grief. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays into your practice and what is that? What's the difference?
Grief is a type of trauma that does affect us in a lot of ways. It is a very specific trauma related to a specific event, and grief can be related to a death. It can be related to a change in your life in some way. It can be, like kids going off to college. That's grief. It's the end of active motherhood. That's an area that I cover. It can be a friendship that's no longer servicing you and you need to let it go. So those are traumas. But the thing is that when we have had significant complex PTSD, what we wind up seeing is that this fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, whichever one is the go-to one for your nervous system, it can really activate around grief. So one of the ways that I work with people around grief is to get them acquainted with what is happening within your nervous system, what is going on, how is this related to your developmental trauma, how is this related to past grief, how is it different than past grief? And so what we do is it's interweaving the trauma-informed care with helping someone learn to deal with their grief and learn to manage it. Because I am a huge believer in the idea of closure is absolutely horsepucky. I do not believe that in one shape or form, because when someone comes into our lives, we are changed markedly, for good, for bad, whatever. And when they leave our lives, we will be changed. So there is no way that we can just snip it up with a little bow and send a person out into the world and be like, you're fine. No, you're not fine. You have been changed. And we just now need to help you integrate that change into your life. So that's where that integration of the trauma and grief comes in.
Wow, that's such powerful work that y'all are doing. Okay, here's my last question. Let's end on this. You're turning into a social media therapist. Where can we find you? Because I love the walking therapy that I'm watching you give me on social media every day.
Well, thank you. I am at Healing with Honey, and it's Honey with an A at the end, on Instagram and on TikTok. We are getting ready to launch my TikTok here soon, but Instagram is my primary. And then the other thing that I'm about to start doing is some longer form talks on YouTube that I'm going to link to through my website, which is www.honeyowens.com.
Well, if anyone needs a social media therapist, I would suggest following Honey. Do you have any tidbits, step-by-step strategy, anything you want to leave anybody with if they're struggling right now, this moment, and they're listening to us?
I would say one of the best things that I can tell people, especially if they're dealing with anxiety-related stuff, is to do some sort of bilateral stimulation. One of them is doing the butterfly hug, which is this one. You can also do that here, and you can also do, there are little that you can put like in your AirPods or earbuds, and they'll ping both sides, or you can just do like this on the top of your legs, or you can just go for a walk. Those are all bilateral stimulation, just using both sides of your body. And that's a really good, easy way to just kind of help your thoughts process more effectively.
Great. And last question, are you taking new clients?
I am. I've got a few spots left. So yeah, and people can contact you on my website and schedule a 15-minute consultation.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to have a one link that is going to give all of your information. I also am going to have all of your favorite books and stuff. I've got that Amazon storefront. So I'm just going to have a curated list of all pod with Honey resources. So that'll also be in the notes, but anything related you're going to see in the show notes. So Honey, thank you so much. I know you have to run. I'm so excited to talk to you today. And I hope that everyone got something amazing just like I did today.
I hope so too. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Charlie, so much for including me. And this has just been an absolute joy to catch up with you and see you and spend some time with you today.
Yeah, you too. Well, I hope you'll come back.
I will. Please invite me anytime. I'd love it.
Excellent.